Hello, and welcome to another edition of Model Aviation Live. Happy Friday, and more importantly, Happy New Year. So the first thing I wanted to share with you all is that we're still having some mail delays. So I'm sharing with you, here's my January issue of Model Aviation, and I just received it earlier this week, which is about 2 weeks later than normal. And in case anybody's wondering, the reason mine's polybag is because I'm a Life member. So if you're a Life member, your magazine comes polybag. But we've been working with our press, and they've identified that there still are mail delays, and we are experiencing mail delays. I know we've received probably a few dozen requests from members who have not received their magazine. So I just want to share with you that it's nothing delayed on our end. It's nothing delayed by the press. Basically, it's just being delayed by the mail. And I know that things should be getting better because we're past the Christmas rush, but we're still experiencing some delays, and even with mail coming in. So we're hearing that there's still delays as much as 3 weeks is what we heard at the beginning of this week from our press, who is, in contact with the Postal Service. So I just want to remind everybody, please be patient. If you haven't received your magazine, we certainly will replace it if need be. But, as evidence of mine, I think it was Tuesday of this week that I received my magazine. So just wanted to kind of share that with you and let you know that that's still happening. So today I bought a Jeep, and I wanted to share this because there might be some scale people who would appreciate this, but I actually bought an RC Rock Hobby 1/6 scale Jeep, and there's going to be a picture of it right here. So I bought this morning, and it's RC. Obviously, it's 1/6 scale, so it's perfect to fit like GI Joe or other type of 1/6 scale figures. I'm a fan of World War II aviation, so I thought it'd be kind of neat to have the Jeep. My grandfather served in World War II. He landed on Omaha Beach. So I just thought it was kind of a neat vehicle. It basically is sort of like a rock crawler, from what I understand. It runs at a scale speed, and it's actually being sold, obviously, by FMS Hobby, who makes a lot of foam composition aircraft. So just kind of wanted to share that with you because I came across it. I thought it was really neat, and so I should have a delivery on it in a few days, and be happy to tell everybody what I think about it. Maybe even put it in Park Pilot, since we're doing some surface stuff on Park Pilot. And so if anyone's interested, I just thought I'd share it since I bought it about a half an hour before I started my day today. Also, I wanted to share with you, you might find it interesting. So when I did the very first episode of Model Aviation Live, it was shot in my home arcade, which has pinball machines and arcade machines. And I also have a full-size RC Dalek in there, and it looks like this. I mean, this is just a small one, but my Dalek looks like this. And on New Year's Day, Doctor Who aired a Dalek special episode on New Year's Day, and the name of the episode was Revolution of the Daleks. And what was really cool is, so my Dalek, my full-size Dalek, is radio controlled. And if Matt pulls up a photo, all the Daleks now on Doctor Who are also radio controlled. So if you look at that Dalek, that they were on the show on January 1st on New Year's Day, and you can see right in front of it, it looks like maybe JR or Spectrum 2.4 gigahertz radio stacked up in front of it. So I found that kind of interesting, thought that I would share that. And so I'm not the only one that has an RC Dalek anymore, apparently. Also want to share with you that today, as you're probably aware, we had AMA air, and then we also had Model Aviation Live. That's never happened before where they fell on the same day. So hopefully a lot of you are joining us after seeing the show, AMA Air, and having the RC Roundtable host that for us. And so I'm sure that they shared with you, but for those that didn't see it, today it's the 15th. So the new issue of Model Aviation's out. So we want the digital version of it. So definitely want to share the cover of Model Aviation with you, the digital edition. There it is. And on the cover, that airplane is actually designed by Terry Dunn, one of the group of the RC Roundtable. And Terry asked me if I mentioned anything about it, to also point out that the plan was drawn by Dan Sponholz, and it's a free plan, free digital download. So we're excited about that, to have a bunch of people go out and build it. If you're interested, what else is in the issue? Fitz Walker, again, another person on the RC Roundtable, wrote an article on Small, which is a long-standing event. So there's an event article, which, sadly, due to the pandemic, we haven't had a lot of events. A lot have been canceled, is what I mean. So we're excited to have that. And then we have an article about the Gallup Model Airplane Club by William Bickle, and talks about his experience in the club. It's a really interesting story. But the other reason we highlighted it is we wanted to share that many stories like William's can be found on the museum website, the History Project. So people can share their stories. You can share your story. You can go read people's stories. So I wanted to publish this story to kind of give you an idea of some of the stories that you can find on the History Project. And then as far as reviews, we've got a glow review for you. We've got a Phoenix Model Edge 540 that's glow powered. We've got the Twisted Hobbies Revolto, which is a foam 3D aircraft. And then we've also got the Retro RC Chicken Hawk. So we've got a lot of different types of aircraft for you for review. So if you look at the digital edition, if you subscribe to the digital edition, that's available for you today. And if you get the print edition, that'll be available to you in 10 to 14 days. And hopefully by that point, we won't have any issues with the mail. So hopefully you'll get your issues on time. And so now I really want to bring out our guest. So today, our guest is a gentleman who's been running a flight school, the first USA flight school, for a long, long time. And I personally attended his flight school and wrote an article about it in Model Aviation that appeared in the January 2010 issue. So I'm excited to talk to him because he's written several articles for us about improving people's flying and how to fly certain maneuvers. And we get a ton of feedback from readers that they really appreciate his articles and his insight. So let's bring Dave Scott onto the show and talk to him.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Is it hard to believe that it was going on 11 years ago that I came to your school?
It doesn't seem like that long ago.
I know. It was a great experience, and I just thoroughly enjoyed everything I learned. And the funny story that I tell people though is that you don't like people who only fly with their thumbs, and you forced me to use my thumb and my forefinger. And I've heard that from other people who have come to your school, that they were thumbs flyers, and that you push them, if you will, or coach them. So for those that maybe are unsure why, do you mind sharing why that is?
Well, sure. First of all, the school is a concentrated period of training, 4 to 5 days. So there's some pressure to get in as much as possible before the end of the week. And the lone thumb flyer, especially if they're feeling some anxiousness, will tend to be more jerky. Whereas a lone thumb flyer that's relaxed will do just fine. But we teach students to proactively control the airplane, to exercise procedure inputs, and then the airplane reacts to them instead of them reacting to the plane. So sometimes to affect whatever outcome we're looking for, it might come down to whether you move the stick a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, or 3/4 of an inch, as opposed to just left, right, up, down. And two fingers, just like two hands on a steering wheel, greatly aids the ability to control the size and pace of the control inputs, and therefore figure out what went wrong when it didn't go right, and how to continue to duplicate the good inputs once you find out what they are.
So we touched on your school. You touched on it a little bit, but for those who didn't see my article or are not familiar with the school, Dave, can you tell them how long you've been instructing, how many people you've instructed, and what someone might expect who would attend your school?
Well, sure. I started the school in 1990. And started out initially only doing primary training. It stems from my club experience, where I was out living in a very industrial area with a lot of second and third shift workers who just couldn't come out to the club on a designated trainer night or trainer afternoon. So as a regular at the field, people started off, and a club instructor, people started offering to pay me if I would come out at a time that worked for them. And one thing led to another. There was such a demand for one-on-one or personalized training that I started a school in 1990, and we scheduled classes that would last 5 days and run throughout the summer, May through September. And each class consists of 3 to 4 people. We provide all the equipment. You just need to get yourself to the school here in central Wisconsin. And those first several years made a ton of mistakes. When you're flying with a deadline as opposed to the recreational club situation, um, uh, the proof is in the pudding. So made a ton of mistakes, but learned a lot of things. And eventually those guys started wanting to come back and take it to the next level. And so after the first several years, migrated into aerobatic training. And now for the last 20 years, most of our instruction is return guys coming back for aerobatic training, and of course some new guys as well. And we still get some beginners in the early part of the year to keep the pool fresh. But primarily do the aerobatics, and that's a 4-day class that runs Monday through Thursday. And to date, we've trained a little over 2,000 people.
Well, I see one of the comments from Greg Gimlick, and he says that you have great books. And I have some props here. So the first book I ever saw, let me get it where you can see it. I've got a light here. There you go. Park Flying 1, 2, 3D was the first book that I ever got. And I've got Sport Aerobatics, and I've got Precision Aerobatics, and I've got a whole stack of your books here, Dave. So tell people what they might find in the books.
Well, the books stem out of running the courses, working with people. And prior to every lesson, you try to keep things limited to just 2 or 3 objectives. Then we go up and experience those objectives. And there's some running commentary during the flight. And then at the end of the flight, a brief on what we did and what we're going to be doing on the next flight, but in very concise chunks. And so I realized I was repeating the same things with each student. So I decided to put together a roadmap that they could follow. And it's lots of pictures, the way I like to study, my favorite. So lots of pictures and concise text points. And ultimately, it's armed or designed so that a person could look at it before they fire up their simulator or before they take to the air, and have 2 or 3 things to work on. And then crawl, walk, run on the next flight, they can add a few more pieces and a few more pieces.
So I'm kind of curious, Dave. Do you have one of your manuals that's a bestseller, or is it just changed constantly?
No, it's consistently the airplane and radio setup. If I had the time, if I could write a setup book, I believe it was Harry Higley who might have done that in the past. But if I could write a setup book for every radio out there, you couldn't keep them on the shelves. There's such a need for that type of thing. There are universal principles or even timeless principles, though, like a wheel works best when it's round. And
Right.
so in my airplane and radio setup, I put down what those universal or timeless principles are. And when it comes to CG, travel, exponential, right thrust, down thrust, it's one of those things where if you get the basics right, that'll get you 95% there. That means there's still 5% remaining, and everyone spends the rest of their life fine tuning the last 5%. But if you don't get the basics right, it doesn't matter what kind of fine tuning your friend is telling you that you need to do or that would help your airplane. CG would be a classic example of that. Probably the biggest issue that I hear from people who purchase the book is stressing the importance of setting up an airplane with lesser travel, and then you can always add more. Our sport is a little the other way. We set up our airplane, or a lot of guys set up their airplanes for what they want to do with the airplane once they get comfortable with it. The problem is if you've torn out your landing gear 3 times and dinged up your airplane because it's such a handful, you're never going to get to your goal. So just common sense, crawl, walk, run fundamentals contained in that book. And then equal to in sales is the 1 week to solo manual that covers the basics. Like I said, with an emphasis on control inputs so that you can achieve consistency, and eventually consistency becomes automatic. And then you can do something that we used to talk about back in the old days. You start thinking ahead of the airplane, start anticipating what your next step is going to be. So the book stresses the fundamentals of control, basic control, and then having a plan when you fly so that you're achieving consistency. You went through this, Jay, with me a little in the beginning. And eventually the payoff is easier landings. As we say in the biz, if you didn't get the landing in the first 100, another 100 probably isn't going to make much difference. The problem is if you have inconsistent fundamentals, it'll show up in inconsistent landings. So that's the kind of information that's covered in 1 Week to Solo, and it was born out of doing it week after week with hundreds and hundreds of beginners.
Well, Dave, it looks like we have another student on with us, Kevin Bryce. He says, hello, Jay. Hello, Dave Scott. I have been through his aerobatics course and have never advanced so quickly in the hobby than under his guidance.
Yep. Kevin's a real talent. He made my job easy that week.
You know, one thing that I tell people about my experience when I went to your school is, you know, you, Dave, you handle putting the airplanes together. You handle breaking them down at the end of the day. You handle any fueling and tuning, and all I have to do is fly, and you know, work on perfecting my flight characteristics. And I'm not a golfer, but the best way I could explain to people is like having a caddy that knows more about golf than you do. And you know, they're telling you which club you need to use, and you know exactly how to do it. That's the best way I can describe it. And I say that very respectfully. That, you know, it was just such a cool experience because all I did was fly continuously for 4 days and focus on making my flying better, and you know, getting better at flying ahead of the aircraft and all the fundamentals that you teach. But you know, for an average person, when you go out to fly, there's a lot of other things you have to do, and I didn't have to worry about any of that. And I really appreciated, you know, that, because it was just the most flying I've ever done in my life over 4 days, quite frankly.
Yes, super, super. Yeah, when you have a 4-day deadline, you guys have enough to focus on. All that we cram in, we might in a beginner course, we're effectively cramming in what the rest of us. I learned essentially through trial and error in my club, and what I eventually discovered after a few seasons in the sport, we're throwing at the student. Sounds kind of harsh, but throwing at the student in just 4 or 5 days. So it's easier if I take care of the rest of it.
Well, certainly, it was a great experience, and obviously, Kevin has mentioned that, and I think it came through in the article. And you know, the fact that, you know, you've been doing it this long and so successful, and I mean, you know, it's the quickest way, I guess, to like Kevin said, it's the quickest way to either learn how to fly or improve your flying. But I'm sure after, you know, all the students that you've trained, I mean, you're probably pretty used to, you know, what the challenges are. And so, you know, I would say, you know, generally speaking, Dave, what are the biggest challenges that people have when they come to your school?
Well, I would say that whether they're at my school or in the club, whether they're a person that's come to the school and comes back for aerobatic training, by far the biggest, I call it the trap, TRAP. The trap is making too many control inputs. In almost everything we do, the better we become, the more proficient we become, the fewer and fewer adjustments we need. There's a misconception in RC often that the better you become, the more and more control inputs you're going to need to make the airplane do what you want it to do. So less is more. And here's a big one. When in doubt, don't do anything. I have a lot of guys that come to the school that struggle with wind, and we have an epiphany on that first day, because there's usually wind here in Wisconsin. On that first day, when they're making too many control inputs, fighting the wind, I'll say, humor me for a second, take your hands off of the controls, and all of a sudden the wind goes away. And it was pilot induced when making too many control inputs. Another way of putting that is when there is turbulence, and the turbulence is usually more encountered more often near the ground. So if you're at 50 feet or 100 feet and the airplane is bouncing around, you're probably having a lot to do with that. So when in doubt, take your hands off of the controls or try to neutralize the controls. You might just find out that the airplane would fly better without so many inputs. And when in doubt, don't do anything.
I mentioned right before we brought you on the show that you've written many articles for Model Aviation, but you've also written for other publications. And I'm kind of curious, how did you get your start writing for air modeling magazines?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I eat, breathe, and sleep this hobby and aviation. I grew up in Oshkosh, so I've known since I was a 1 year old what I wanted to do, what I wanted to immerse myself in. And originally, my first books were Xerox copies of line drawings I made with a pencil. And then with the advent of the computer, I had a honeymoon period where I was learning how to use the different programs to draw, and it lined up perfectly with running the flight school and the first versions. My 1 week to solo was probably on about its 15th version. The first couple of versions were a little rough, but that just was an incentive to get better at it, and it just sort of fed on itself.
One of the articles that you wrote that I think really resonated, I mean, they all do, but you wrote an article about picking the right aircraft for your skill set. And we actually ran it a second. We ran it the first time, and then we actually ran it a second time. And we got a lot of comments on that, but we get a lot of comments on all your articles. So maybe for those that missed that, can you give just kind of a little bit of, what you talked about picking the right airplane?
Yes, that's something I have to stress quite often. Is some would say before you even give your credit card number, you should be putting some thought into your skill level and what you want to do with your airplane, and try to target your purchase around what you're going to do with it. Now, you might aspire to do something more advanced, say 3D, or fly a four-engine B-17. But if you bite off too much, really you're taking your future goal and you're pushing it out because you're going to have more struggles along the way. One of the sayings we use in the school is boring is good. If like an ultra stick is a perfect basic aerobatic airplane, or an airplane after you become proficient at landing with a primary trainer, that airplane is literally like several airplanes in one. And if you can become proficient with that airplane, you're really the future's wide open. You can take on anything. But if you start out with, say, an extra 300, when your landings are already a little iffy to begin with, then you throw something with that kind of performance into the mix, and you're going to not have as much fun. You start making excuses to avoid flying because you're getting tired of fixing landing gears and so forth. So the old principle of crawl, walk, run.
I think sometimes the comment often is that when people are brand new to the hobby, they want the P-51 Mustang, right off the bat. They don't want the boring looking trainer, but obviously, that's where you need to start. Now, certainly technology such as SAFE and AS3X has allowed people to fly aircraft that are a little bit more advanced, or even if they are proficient in flying, help them on, windier conditions, or, not having to make as many corrections. And, from what I've read, you're very supportive of that technology, Dave, to get people going. Can you talk about your thoughts around those type of technologies and how they benefit pilots?
Oh, I just think it's fantastic, and I experience, have firsthand experience with this. The point is that it removes obstacles, even forgives pilot error, or let's say we have an individual who's basically training themselves. My wife learned to solo in 2 flights with an apprentice on full safe, and there was about a 20-25 mile an hour wind at the time, and there were 4 or 5 club members there who were waiting until the winds died down. She soloed on her second flight. Now, she had such a great experience that instead of poo-pooing toy model airplanes, she couldn't wait to get out to the flying field again. And now she's evolved to where we don't fly with the safe. It's kind of like learn your basics, get it ultimately. Take it home in one piece, and we'll build on that. And eventually, like a lot of people I talk with, I correspond with, you don't have to take off with it off for the first time. You can get some altitude, flip a switch, fly around for a minute or two, get a taste for it, then flip it back on when it comes to the critical moment to bring it back down. And you'll surprise yourself. A couple days later, you forgot to turn the safe back on. You brought it in for a landing without. And what's ultimately behind that? For one, you're flying instead of repairing your airplane, but your confidence is established. And so crawl, walk, run with the safe too.
I think Jason Merkel, who works for Horizon Hobby and does a lot of their videos showcasing new aircraft, I think he said something that kind of resonated with me because, I mean, obviously I know how to fly. So every time I would get a Horizon aircraft that had safe, I never enabled it because I didn't need it. I wouldn't use it. And he made a comment, I think it was in one of his videos, and he said that he enables safe for two reasons. One is, he's often flying at Eli Field or at events, and sometimes people want to fly, because he's flying new Horizon aircraft and people want to fly it. And, he wants them to fly it. He wants them to try it. But, you don't know when someone walks up, you don't know their skill set. So, put it on safe and see how they do and if they're comfortable with it. And then maybe if they are, then maybe you take it off safe. But even if they're a beginner, they can still, try the aircraft. And obviously, we all know the first time you actually control an aircraft, I mean, the joy in that. So that was one reason that he enable safe on all his aircraft. And the second reason he used was that, he's had a case, and I think we all have, where you temporarily lose your aircraft into the sun. And he was like, if that happens, just flip on safe and take a moment and compose yourself and find the airplane. And you're not quite as panicked because it's going to be able to, fly on its own temporarily while you're ready. So since he said that, I've started to put safe on my aircraft going forward in my radio.
Well, I think it's a godsend to the sport, and in the flight school, because everything is structured. We rehearse control inputs before flying. It's all about staying, like teaching a kid how to drive a car. It's about staying out of trouble, not what to do if you get into trouble. And frankly, a person probably isn't going to be able to say, if they lose control, they're probably not going to be able to save themselves until they are a more advanced pilot or a club instructor who has experience doing those types of maneuvers, unusual attitudes on purpose in their own personal flying. They fly sport aerobatics. And then you're going to be able, when your student rolls the airplane into a spiral or inverted, it's no big deal to recover the airplane. But if you don't have that kind of structure, if basically you're on your own, or even if the instructor, he has other things going on, his own flying and distractions. So maybe you didn't have time to brief before the flight, and he hands you the box, or I should say, gives you control through the buddy system, and there wasn't a lot of discussion beforehand. It's going to be the difference between whether that person is discouraged or can't wait for their next flight.
The first experience I ever had with safe was on an apprentice, and wanted to see how it worked. And so I rolled the apprentice inverted, maybe about 20 to 25 feet up, and flipped the switch, and it snapped so fast to upright that it actually threw one of the rubber bands off the wing. And I was just amazed. I mean, I don't think I could have snapped it that fast. I mean, I'm sure I couldn't have snapped it that fast, and it's really impressive, what they're able to do. And, so AS3X safe, or other stabilization systems, those are helping. Another thing that I want to talk to you about, because you've written about this too, is about how making sure, if you choose to get a flight simulator, to use it to your benefit. So could you talk a little bit about how you see the importance of a flight simulator and how you feel it should be used if your goals are to improve your flying?
Well, that's the key point right there. If your goals are to improve your flying, we start with, if you want the simulator to benefit your real world flying, you need to treat it seriously. There are some shortcomings, if you want to call them that, but for the most part, if you were working on your landings in the real world, you would be wise the night before to fire up your simulator and practice. And if you can't do it on the simulator, the odds of being able to do it in the real world are I don't know whether you would think that would happen. So the flight simulator, just like in full scale, well, I shouldn't say that. In full scale, the simulators are now sophisticated enough where you can actually get the sensation of flying the airplane. But for many years, the simulator was good for learning procedures. Like if your engine was on fire, or if you had a flap that wouldn't retract, and you'd learn how the sequence of turning off pumps and how to deal with that emergency. And I think the simulator in RC is great for learning procedure, how to do a turn. I'm going to say it. You'd be foolish if you wanted to learn to fly inverted. You'd be foolish to go out to the field like we did back in the day and try to learn to fly inverted in real time at 70 miles an hour. But you could spend a night or two on the simulator and get to the point where you can roll the airplane inverted on takeoff and never roll upright again for the next 15 minutes, and that's going to go a long way to when you get out to the flying field. Maybe there'll be a bit of a difference in the real world. Maybe a little more push is needed, but it doesn't change the fact that you are comfortable pushing when you're inverted. Same thing with, say, a person learning to use rudder or learning to manipulate the throttle. I watch countless videos, and frankly, it's a little unsettling that you see them punch the throttle to full, especially if it's a beautiful airplane like a B-17 or a P-47. They leave it at full throttle the whole time, and the scale speed looks like it's a sped up video. And so if a person felt, well, I need to master the throttle or master the rudder, say during a slow roll or the backside of a loop, that's where what the simulator is made for. I cut my teeth on it on the sim, and then I go out into the real world, and maybe it's a little bit different, but 10% difference isn't going to inhibit you.
Another benefit of the simulator for people like you and I, Dave, who live somewhere where it's freezing and snowing out, and we probably don't want to go out and fly, we can continue to keep our skills up through the winter. And that's one of the ways that I use my simulator. And I'm also excited, and you probably know this, but with Realflight 9.5, we now have the AMA's International Aero Modeling Center Site 3 is in Realflight. So I can fly here in my home office like I'm, at AMA, which is about 2 miles from where I'm sitting. But I'm thrilled with that because previously it was only in Aerofly, which is another great simulator, but Aerofly was the only place that you could fly at the AMA flying site. And now with Realflight 9.5, which if you have 9, you can upgrade to 9.5 for free, which is what I did. So I'm really excited about that. But, to your point, Dave, I learned how to do 4-point rolls on the simulator before I ever tried it in real life. And I nailed it the very first time that I tried it in real life because you know what to expect. You, generally speaking, you know how it's going to react. And, the biggest pushback that I hear from modelers, Dave, and I'm sure you hear this, is, yeah, simulator's great, but, for $100+ or whatever that simulator costs, I can buy my first airplane or put that money towards my first airplane. And I try to remind people that, that reset button is free. If you totally destroy your first airplane because you weren't prepared, or maybe you didn't have an instructor or whatever it is, I mean, that flight simulator paid for itself if you save one airplane. Do you hear that a lot? Do you hear that pushback about people not wanting to invest in a sim from a financial standpoint?
It's less and less every year as the mainstreaming of technology. The mindset is to take advantage of your tools that are available to you. And I think where the simulator even becomes more beneficial is after you've learned to fly and you're starting to cut your teeth on some new maneuvers. I don't know if this is related, but when my business was evolving to where I wanted to go to events and put on air show displays, kind of to bring attention to the flight school, I developed my choreography, my routine on the simulator first, and ran into issues where spacing or altitude didn't work. And who knows how long to get to the point where I had a nice flowing, workable routine, how long it would have taken me in the real world to get to that point. And then I did the exact same thing with my full-scale air show. I don't know how many gallons of avgas I would have burned having buddies on the ground trying to communicate to me what my maneuvers, what my routine looked like. So I fired it up in Realflight. I made a very heavy pit special that had a more scale power to weight ratio, and I developed a choreography. Found some things didn't work, and then when I went out and flew the routine for the first time, I was 95% there, and had to do a little tweaks here and there. But it's such a time saver and a confidence builder.
You've probably heard this story before, Dave, but you and I were talking about Jim Burke previously, who's been involved with Realflight and is now an airshow pilot like yourself, Dave. And he liked to practice because, you can have flight failures in Realflight, and he would purposely break off either the left wing or the right wing, and he would fly his airplane a knife edge and practice that, and then land it on the runway without destroying the airplane. And that really actually happened to him on a flight. He lost half of his wing, and he was able to fly to knife edge and then land it on the runway without any further damage. And there's no other way to practice for that other than in the sim. And when he was practicing in the sim, he didn't think he was actually going to use it, but he did. So I mean, to me, that's like the best testament of what you can achieve from using the simulator.
Yep. Once in a while, we encounter rain, usually in Wisconsin because of the effects of the lakes and where we're in the central of the part of the country. Weather moves through here pretty quickly. And so we might have a morning where there's rain, and we'll go to the local airport, their conference room. We'll fire up the flight simulator in the meantime until the weather clears. And I have countless stories of an area where a guy was struggling with at the field the day before. Once they have a chance to do it on the simulator, because you have that space bar, if you make a mistake, you just try again. And so much of this stuff is getting the procedure down. And so finally, without the real world distractions of wind and concern about embarrassment or making a mistake, they get a chance to put 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 good ones together. And then I know this will sound awfully convenient, but when we go out to the flying field, boom, it's there. They can now do it. Just needed that little bit to get over the hump.
So, Dave, when you think about everything that you've taught, your manuals, what you teach at school, what you've written, countless magazine articles, would you say of all the skill sets of flying, just, and it doesn't necessarily have to be aerobatics, but to take off and fly ahead of the airplane and have a successful flight and landing, would you say landings is the most difficult thing for people?
Well, it's the least forgiving. It's the
Right.
one that evidences whether you were doing the right things up to that point. A primary trainer will almost land itself. We teach initially that on a flare to landing, just hold about a 1/4 inch of a elevator and we'll go boing, boing down the field, but it won't hurt anything. And what we really need to focus on is that landing setup. So if a person can come out of that base leg turn lined up with the extended center line of the runway, unless they add a lot of extra to that, it's going to be a successful outcome. Probably the thing that comes to mind listening to your question is a person who thinks the landing is a bear, is struggling with their landing, and there's all kinds of reasons why they might think it is. But usually it started 30 seconds earlier. Like so many things in this world, the bad landing or the inconsistent landing is the thing you focus on, but one should really try and question, why are some of them working and some of them not? And know what the answer is. It's those landing setups are not consistent. So a little prudent prior planning can go a long way. So in the school, for example, we'll walk out on the runway when nobody's in the air, and we'll look down the center line. We'll pick ground references. And the whole point of it is we pick ground references to aid with consistency. If you pick the wrong ones, or if there's wind that causes the base leg turn to maybe go wide, well, that's a point of reference. Now we can make a change. The problem is even an instructor can help a student. Even a veteran flyer can help a sport pilot. If no 2 landing setups go the same, I can tell you what went wrong on the last one. But if on the subsequent landing setup you introduce a couple new variables, you can take my advice and throw it in the trash. So consistency is the name of the game. And I guess that to bookend that, some planning. And if when I do this with my students all the time, if I ask you a question and the first thing out of your mouth is you're not ready. It's probably not going to happen magically on its own in the air. Now there's a mindset that you'll figure it out when you get into the air, and that might work. That might have been acceptable way back when in the old days, but nowadays people have so many things on their plate that if they don't start experiencing some success or keep the success going, they'll start losing interest and move on to something else. So a little planning goes a long way. Even, and the point is, even if they're making a mistake, as long as you had a plan, it kind of points you in the direction of how to affect a better outcome if you started with a plan.
You know, we got another question here. It says, oh, it's just a statement from Fitz, who's one of the RC Roundtable. Good approach makes a good landing.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I
So,
do this with my, if I do this thing with my students. When one person is flying, the other three are waiting their turn. And a minute before a guy lands, I'll put my thumb up in the air, thumbs up or a thumb down. And the other three guys are now, I have their attention. And when the guy does a great landing, I'll say, you see how I had my thumb up? Is the landing setup, everything was where it should be. Other times I'll give a thumbs down. The pilot flying is concentrating on the plane, doesn't know I'm doing this, but the other three students are seeing this and they're paying attention. And when the guy has a poor landing, or we have to do a go around, or if I have to recover the airplane, I point out cause and effect. I knew it was going to be a difficult landing 30 seconds before the guy experienced it because he was out of position.
well, that brings up a good question. So, what would you say, generally speaking? You know, we all have to decide when we're coming in for that landing approach. You know, are we going to go for it? Or are we going to go around? And so, what are some tips you have about that and making that choice and when you should make that choice?
Well, there's a lot of variables, obviously. The full scale mantra would be if there's any question, go around. The problem is, what if you've just done a couple of go arounds? Then the guy thing kicks in where you start forcing it. But we all make mistakes from time to time. But if it's a consistent mistake or the need to go around is consistent. Maybe not flying is the answer, but go walk out on that runway and see if you can get a better placement of your landmarks. And it's been around before I was born. Do low passes. A landing is essentially like setting up a low pass, but you decide instead of going around to cut the motor and put her down on the ground. So if you're struggling with your landings, or you're on edge about whether you should go around or commit to landing, maybe hold off. I do this with the students all the time. I actually have a kitchen timer that I use in the school, where if I see a person is getting ahead of themselves, they're so fixated on trying to get that airplane down on the ground, they're neglecting the fundamentals. I'll say, okay, Bob, I'm going to set this kitchen timer for 5 minutes. We'll work on low passes for 5 minutes, and then we'll shoot a landing. He'll land on his first pass. I'll say, forget about the kitchen timer. It's looking too good to pass up. Why don't you land the airplane? It's kind of like when you drive your car to work. Is you're not thinking about your parking stall or the roads that on the way to your, or when you get to work. You're thinking about the road you're on, and then making that right turn on Maple, and then there's work. And landing is the same way. The best thing you can do is try not to land, but focus on your setup, and then you switch gears and decide this looks too good to pass up. I'll shoot a landing. And then, of course, I guess we bookend that with if there's a question about it, go around.
One of the articles that I actually reached out to you, Dave, and I asked you to write, and I'm pretty comfortable that you've never written on this topic for a magazine. I asked you to basically write an article to train the trainers, to help club instructors become better instructors. And you provided a great article and you provided great direction. So, you know, obviously that was a few years ago we ran that. So do you have could you give a few tips for those who are club trainers or training other people to be successful?
Well, one is we all do this to some degree. We forget how overwhelming it is when you get into the sport. And I find that it's just common with us guys. We can't help but want to dazzle the student a little bit with our expertise and our knowledge, and the student is very appreciative. It's a very good. It makes you feel good when the student appreciates your efforts and your expertise, and so we tend to get a little carried away and add even more expertise, and the person is dazzled and grateful, but what we've really done is given them way too much to digest, to be able to implement in the air. So keep it really, really simple, and keep it minimize the agendas for each flight to just a couple of objectives. And then after the flight, and that's a good point. It's between flights we have these discussions about what needs to be remedied and what we're going to improve upon. We forget that beginner, if he has a 130 IQ, when he's flying the airplane for those first few flights, he's probably working at a 20 IQ, as overwhelming as everything is initially. So keep it simple in the beginning. We can always add more detail as we go. The other thing is, back to the safe. Again, the student is probably just trying to work out their left from their right when the airplane's coming at them. If we could, there's a lot of pushback, or there's been in the past pushback against the safe technology, but we can always turn it off later on. Initially, what's wrong with putting the safe on? Give the guy every opportunity for success, and then, like I say, in 5-6 flights, maybe we're turning it off for periods, shorter followed by longer periods while they're practicing.
You also wrote an article for us talking about clubs and challenges that clubs encounter, and that garnered a lot of feedback as well. So, I'm curious your thoughts about that article, and then also, if anything's changed since you wrote that article a few years ago, or do you think it's pretty much the same now as when you wrote that article?
It is the same, and it's pretty much the same methodology for every successful organization. You don't need to do anything new in the modern era for a club to thrive. There are clubs that are thriving all over the country. I visit them. And yeah, one common characteristic, that one or two or three guys at the top are very positive and accentuate the positive, very enthusiastic. Invariably, they have a dog in the fight. They fly. And if the leadership is pushing flying as opposed to the politics, I mean, anytime you get a group of guys together, you're going to have some conflicts with personalities and views and so forth. But as long as the centerpiece is we're about flying, we can kind of just deal with those other things as we go. And people forget that when the beginner gets into the sport, yes, they're going to learn construction techniques. They're going to learn motors. They're going to learn batteries. They're going to learn aerodynamics and all the rest. But when they got in because flying looked really cool. That looked like a lot of fun. And if you put too many roadblocks, like, okay, if we expect too many things before that person gets that thrill of flying, they can become discouraged. So one common characteristic of all the thriving clubs is a beginner comes out, or anyone comes out to the field with a new model or new to the sport. The leadership gets them in the air. As you were mentioning earlier about with the safe technology. Get that person on the sticks and see if they get the bug. We'll go from there.
Yeah, I think that's it. Being able to get that flight in and try it is huge. I mean, give them that first experience, and then you can teach them and work on fundamentals. But we've got to let them try it and see what it's all about. And so I think while you're talking, I was thinking about when I learned how to fly. I was probably about 6 or 7, and interestingly, my father, who's actually going to be our guest next month, my father's going to be on this show, and I'm going to ask him if I was a good pilot, because I've never asked him that. But a point I want to make is my father chose not to teach me how to fly. He thought it would be easier to have someone else teach me how to fly. So it was actually a father and son team that taught me how to fly. The son was about the age of my father, and then his father. So it was a gentleman named Mike, who was about the age of my father, and then his father, Roland, and they taught me how to fly. And it's really interesting that Roland had a VW bus, and that's what we would take to the field. So it would be Mike and Roland, and then my father and I, and we'd load all our airplanes into this VOW bus, and we would go to the field. And they taught me how to fly. And next month, I'll share a photo of me at like 6 years old flying, and I've got my dad on one side and Mike on the other. And I'm going to ask you something about that real quick. But since I mentioned that, I do want to say, unfortunately, that I got news earlier this week that Roland passed away, sadly. But I believe he was in his early 90s, and he flew and built model airplanes, all the way. And when I was flying down in Florida, before I moved here, I was flying at a park called Walter Fuller Park, and he would come there and fly. So I, flew with him up till 13 years ago. And let me see if I get the right side here. There's right there is a red airplane. That's a Mountain Model Switchback, and Roland built that airplane right there. So I'm really thankful to have that, and I can enjoy that and think about those memories. But what I want to ask you, Dave, is I don't know if you have any insight on this, but with talking about instructing people, do you think that's wise advice? Is it easier to have someone else teach rather than a parent or a brother or sister, or do you think really anyone can be successful?
I think that's the answer is probably as varied as people are varied. It depends. What you're talking about reminds me of when I started out, and my father and I, it did not work. He thought he would teach me. He thought he'd learn to fly, and then he'd teach me. And it wasn't very long. I was well down the road, and he was still trying to figure out his left from his right. So I hooked up with a couple of mentors in the club, and I probably think about those people to this day at least once or twice a week. And I guess what we're talking about is there's the instruction side of it, but there's also the relationship that'll last forever, at least in your mind. I can't imagine if that to have that part removed from my experience in the sport. So I'll tell you this: that if it doesn't look like it's working between whoever the instructor and the student, it probably doesn't get any better. You might be best off to go find somebody that maybe you gel with a little bit more. Doesn't mean that one person was doing anything right or wrong. Just people are that varied.
So we touched on in our conversation today, you touched on a little bit about your full scale flying. So for those that may not be familiar with that part of your hobby, could you share a little bit about that?
Well, I grew up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, attending EAA since I was a baby. And so I always knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't have the means. So I flew RC models instead. And when the first RC flight school reached a point of success where I was able to start pursuing my full scale goals, I would have liked to have written a check for an extra 300, but I didn't have that much money. So I started building a Pitts S1S. And going to Oshkosh, I was up to speed on all the mods that everybody was doing to those airplanes. And the Pitts is known as the biggest bang for the buck. Wood and steel tubes and flying wires as opposed to carbon fiber modern materials. So I cracked down on that about 90 hours a week. And in 2 years, I built my Pitts S1S. And then I entered competition immediately. My test flight, I did several loops and rolls with the airplane because if you have a Pitts, that's what you do with it. As soon as I flew my 50 hours off to prove the FAA that the thing was airworthy, I started competing in the intermediate and then worked through the advanced levels of IAC competition to cut my chops, to develop my skills. And along the way, I started flying some air shows on the side. And as time has gone by, the air shows have supplanted the competition. And I typically fly about 12 to 14 air shows a year in the airplane I built.
And we have a picture of it right now on screen from when I went to your school. You were working on it, and there's a picture of you with it.
Yes. What does that bring back memories? If you did a close up on my hands, they would look like I had been in a fight with a bunch of cats. They're also torn up from building your own airplane.
So do a lot of times, Dave, we'll hear, maybe people aren't flying full scale anymore for whatever reason, and so they moved to modeling
Mhm.
because they a lot of their skill sets and knowledge can help them with modeling. In your case, right, you were into aero modeling first and you went to full scale. So how did being a RC pilot help you as a full scale pilot? I mean, I know you mentioned you practiced your routine on the simulator, but beyond that, how did it help you? How did it transition?
Oh, it was a huge, huge help. It's relative. Sometimes people will talk about models and real airplanes. Well, a model is a real airplane. It's on a smaller scale. Look at NASA uses models in its wind tunnels because the principles are the same in general, the same. So when I got into actually before I got my pilot's license, I flew a 6-hour course, aerobatic course in a super decathlon, and then returned home and secured an instructor to get my pilot's license and so forth. But other than having to use my feet as opposed to a rudder stick, the techniques are the same, are relative, and so I knew how to do all that stuff. I just needed to get comfortable doing it in the full scale. I'm working on an article right now for you guys that addresses the debate of which is tougher, RC or full scale. And to me, it's a wash. But there is a caveat. If you are an expert RC pilot, it's going to upset you when you can't master that full scale airplane overnight. And if you're a full scale pilot who flies 767s, it's going to irk you when you can't land your apprentice at your feet, on the first day. But once we get up over the hump, to have the RC experience going into full scale makes a huge, huge difference. And the full scale guys, they have a little bit of probably 9 out of 10 people that come to the school are or were full scale pilots. And so they already know how to do this stuff. They just have to get over the blow to the ego that it's going to take just a little more time than just a few flights to start thinking about what your fingers are doing as opposed to looking over the nose of the plane. And now when it comes to basic flying, I think that full scale is probably easier when it comes to the basics, but I think that RC is much easier when it comes to aerobatic flying. You can see what the airplane is doing. Now in full scale, if we approached it the same way that some guys do RC with no instruction and no plan, the outcome probably isn't going to be very nice. So in full scale, a lot of people think it's easier to do full scale, but that's because you studied your books and your DVDs, and you had an instructor and you had a plan before you went up and practiced.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about another thing that you taught me at your school, and that was before you take off, any flight of the day, have a plan on what you want to accomplish or what you're going to practice. Because I think a lot of us, generally speaking, we don't do that. We take off and we bore holes in the sky. And, you taught that, figure out what you want to improve on, or what you want to work on, or what you're going to try to accomplish. And I think that's very important, because then you set a goal for yourself and you work to achieve it. So I don't want to steal your fire. Do you have anything else to say about that?
Well, just the first thing that comes to mind is some people. One reason why the school is a success is I'm always trying to put myself into other people's shoes. Some people could interpret that as making it a job or making it work. I'm in the sport to just relax and enjoy myself. You guys that have plans, who want to be world champions and so forth, you're taking the fun out of it a little bit. I would disagree. Go to a club and watch a person like Jay, who has a little bit of a plan, and watch his attitude and how much fun he's having versus the guy who just punches the throttle and has to make thousands of split-second decisions. One of the characteristics you'll see is a person who doesn't have a plan, their flights are pretty short. After about 3 or 4 minutes, they're back down on the ground because that's enough for now. I need a little break. Whereas the person who has a plan, you can just see the goals coming to you. You can see yourself, you can track your progress, and you might run your airplane out of battery or out of fuel before you're done in that pursuit of that next goal.
I see a comment here from Ted Brindle about what we're talking about and what you were talking about. He says we have a 777 instructor pilot in our club, and he crashed more than anyone his first year of flying models. So as you said, sometimes there still can be challenges even if you have that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But once the full-scale pilot gets over the hump, they can then apply that vast experience and usually do pretty well for themselves.
Well, I think we all obviously have a passion for all things that fly, and it doesn't matter if it's a model or if it's full scale. It doesn't matter if it's free flight or a control line or any type of RC. It doesn't matter if it's a helicopter or a drone. I mean, we're all flying and we're all appreciating our hobby. And what I always say to people is that our hobby gives us the ability basically to build or and fly any aircraft we could ever imagine. Right above me right here is a 1/6 scale Sopwith Pup, and I have an Eindecker behind me. I really enjoy World War One airplanes. I'm never going to fly a full scale World War One airplane. At least I'm fairly confident of that. But every day I can go out and fly an RC version of it and have just as much enjoyment. And I love going. We have a Dawn Patrol event, and we have like Indiana Warbird campaign and several events at AMA. And I just love going out because scale is what interests me. And I love going out and just seeing what everybody's built and what everybody's flying. So, they're all, it's all great. And we should embrace it. And it shouldn't be about, well, you're flying a ready to fly and I spent a whole winter building my airplane. It doesn't matter as long as we all are having enjoyment in the hobby. And maybe those people that are flying ready to flies don't have the skill or time, but it still brings them into our hobby and lets them enjoy our hobby. And then maybe down the road, then they move on. Maybe then they go from a ready to fly to an ARF, and then they go from an ARF to a kit. We see that a lot. And sometimes, it bugs me. Sometimes I hear people tell me building is dead. And I'm like, no, building isn't dead, because I talk to, the retro RCs and the old school model works and the mountain models and the Stevens Aero models and the BMJRs and all these kit companies. And they're all doing really well, especially now with the pandemic and people being home more. People are building. So, you and I had a conversation on the phone, and I said something to the effect of what I just said, and you complimented me on that. And but I think that's important. Let's just embrace the enjoyment of flight, and it doesn't matter what you're flying.
Boy, I could not have said that any better.
Got a question here. It says, do either of you have a recommendation on documenting on taking a DIY RC aircraft and populating it with components? Documentation on taking a DIY RC aircraft and populating it with components. I would say, obviously you need to look at the size of the aircraft and figure out, is it electric? Is it gas? Is it glow? What servos it might need. And for help in that, I would recommend that you compare it to an ARF or a kit or a ready to fly, So if it's the same size as that Eindecker behind me, then look at a manufacturer's recommendation on what it should be powered with and what type of servos you should use. Do you have anything you want to add to that question, Dave?
Oh, exactly. I do this for a living, and when it comes to electrics, I'm still a little foggy about some of the numbers when we're looking at motors and et cetera. And so I find me an example that's already out there, maybe a ready to fly or bind and fly model, and what speed control, what motor, what prop, what servos they're running in it, and duplicate it.
Absolutely. Now, I wanted to save an exciting announcement till the end of our conversation, but you have a very exciting announcement about a scholarship program, and it's also going to be in the magazine. So please tell us all about that.
I'm so thrilled about this. One of my students has made a donation to the school. I told him that I wanted to do this, and he surprised me and made a donation to the school that makes it possible for four young people between the ages of 13 and 18 to come to our school. We're going to do this class in mid-July, and again, four young people. Everything will be the tuition. They'll get an airplane, they'll get a flight simulator, they'll get training manuals, and the word has gotten out about this scholarship. So some of my other students are starting to chip in, and there's a high likelihood we'll also be able to cover their travel expenses, motel, probably up to them to pay for their meals. But so in mid-July, we're going to run a class sponsored by one of my students students with 4 young people. Everything will be taken care of, and in order for them to, they'll be chosen from a stack of letters that we're receiving where they're expressing why they think the school would benefit them. If they have goals in aviation, what those goals might be, and or even in engineering fields or sciences. Model aviation teaches all of that stuff, engineering, a lot of science, a lot of technical um, stuff. And we've already received several dozen letters. We're hoping to get hundreds more, and we'll pick the young people from those letters. Probably looking for or going to lean, not necessarily, but lean toward maybe some disadvantaged kids that otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity to fly RC.
That's an amazing opportunity. So, Dave, is there a way for people that they're watching this either live or watch it after the fact, if they want to help, if they want to donate to allow maybe more people to attend or whatnot? Is there a way to do that?
Absolutely. We're setting up a scholarship fund. Any money that comes in for this effort will certainly go towards the kids. And my address is the First RC Flight School address is 314 West Pine Street in Shawano. I'll spell that Shawano, Wisconsin 54166, and specify that it's for the kids. And we want to grow. We're just amazed by. We told a couple of people, and within a couple of weeks, we had already received several dozen letters and a lot of feedback from people out in the sport that think it's a great idea, and some have even offered to do more than just to say thanks. And so we would like to expand this, and I don't know, maybe a year or two from now, we'll have a whole summer's worth of just working with the young people.
Well, I think that it's a great opportunity, and I hope that maybe you could do an article about it after the fact and share the stories of those that were involved. And I'll get with you after. I'd like to make a donation to make this happen.
Oh, oh, super, super.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always said the well, I say to my students all the time, because people who come to a commercial flight school are pretty committed to this sport, and therefore many of them are movers and shakers in their clubs. And you have issues with noise, you have issues with various complaints, and the first thing we take a lesson from watching television: make it about the kids. Rather than the public sees it as grown men playing with toys, we can debate, with them, but they have no point of reference. But if you make it about the kids, our future astronauts, well, if there are astronauts, our future airline pilots, military pilots, engineers, scientists, a lot of them get their start in model aviation of some or modeling of some sort. And so if you promote when there's a noise complaint that, hey, this exists here to raise up the next generation of scientists and engineers, all of a sudden the seas part a little bit for us. So I see this as a great opportunity to spread the goodwill that we're not just playing with toys.
That's awesome. And like I said, we'll have something in the magazine as well, so everybody can see it, and if they want to contribute to it, and they can be aware of it. And if there's people that want to apply, they can do that. We've covered a lot of topics over the last hour or so. Dave, is there anything else? Is there anything I didn't ask, or is there anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I think you hit a lot of pertinent day-to-day, where the rubber meets the road subjects, and I'm looking forward to getting some feedback.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today. And, like I said, I really have enjoyed working with you with the articles. We get so much feedback. I mean, your articles get some of the most feedback of all of our articles, because people, everybody wants to improve, and your articles are very helpful. So we've really enjoyed that. And, like I said, I really enjoyed attending your school. And, when we talked, I was like, let's have you on the show and just talk about some of this, and especially now with the scholarship. So I'm glad that we could promote that. And, I greatly appreciate your time today. And I would recommend everybody check out your website and check out your manuals, and look for some upcoming articles from you. in model aviation as we go further into 2021. So I wish you the best for the scholarship program, and we'll look forward to an article about that once it's actually happened.
Thank you, Jay. It's been great fun. Thank you for this opportunity.
All right. Well, as I shared earlier, our next show will be February. I believe it's February 19th. There it is. Our next episode, Friday, February 19th. My father will be my guest. I don't know if I got the idea from David Letterman or not, but he was from this area, and he brought his mom on his show. So I thought, it'd be kind of neat to bring my father on the show. My father owned a hobby shop when I was a kid. He worked at one hobby shop, and he owned a hobby shop. He's been a club president, and he's been a club safety officer. And I just want to find out if I was a good pilot growing up, because I never asked him. So I hope everybody joins us next month on February 19th. You get to meet my father. His name is also Jay Smith. So I look forward to that. And thanks for everyone for joining us. And again, thank you, Dave. And we'll see everyone next month.